My latest project is an exhibit that's happening at the Atlantic Avenue subway station in Brooklyn, and it's kind of a look back at 10 years of photographing Brooklyn's waterfront and how the industrial waterfront has changed over the past decade. The MTA has a program called the Arts for Transit project, and they approach all kinds of different artists to do different unique works in the subway system, and they contacted me and said they wanted to do this exhibit of my photographs. The subway exhibit is a pretty interesting one because it's in this really busy corridor, so you have millions of people who pass through there on their daily commute. I think it's kind of fascinating to have the artwork in that context because some people only have the time to give it like a glimpse or like a brief turn of the head to look at it. Other people may scan them as they walk along. And some people really have seen actually stop and kind of be halted in their tracks and find a picture that they love and just sort of stand there and become immersed by the work. The photos are printed at the same scale as like the advertisements in the subway, and I think that's one of the interesting things. Usually as you pass through these spaces, you're surrounded by someone trying to sell you something. My work is focused on really trying to make people look at their surroundings in a different way and have them look at things that they wouldn't normally think about, that they wouldn't even normally consider. So to have these photographs of these buildings and these spaces in the subway system is a pretty fascinating thing. It's really like an opportunity to, I guess, have people, a whole different crowd of people really engage with these spaces that most of the time they just won't even give a second look at. So for this particular set of photographs, I've been working on it for about the past 10 years. I moved to Brooklyn about 13 years ago and became interested in exploring the waterfront because I lived like about a block and a half away from this industrial canal that is in Brooklyn called the Gowanus Canal. And I started exploring the canal and started photographing around the canal, and then really the work radiated out from there and started to encompass these other waterfront neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And at the same time as I started kind of falling in love with like these unique industrial waterfront areas, the city started tearing them all down. And it was this collection of homes from the 1800s inside the Brooklyn Navy Yard called Admirals Rail. It's a set of buildings that I photographed first, I think in 2007 or 2008. And I went inside the buildings, which were totally off limits, and documented them, took photographs of all the buildings. And then I went back again last year because I knew that they were going to be torn down sometime soon. And I documented them again and kind of saw how they had continued to decay over the years, what was left inside. And then I again went back as they were being demolished and did a whole other series of photographs looking at the process of taking the buildings down. At the same time that we were hanging that photograph in the subway, one of my friends texted me and said, they're demolishing the buildings right now, you have to get over here. So I left the subway with my camera and went over and watched them like tearing this building down, and then came back to the subway and like had them hanging this photograph on the wall. In exploring these like waterfront neighborhoods, you see a lot of these really interesting old structures that have managed to survive, like warehouses and powerhouses and old shipping docks, and they've held on up until really like the last decade in New York City, and unfortunately are now disappearing pretty fast. We're in the process of taking down like all of the old historic industrial architecture right now. We're removing like all kinds of 1800s buildings and just kind of erasing them from the landscape. So as I became interested in documenting these waterfront neighborhoods, I also became interested in documenting the buildings that were there and how those buildings told this story and told the history of these places. I kind of feel like once you take the buildings down and remove them, you're not left with the same neighborhood. You're really just erasing like the whole history of it. We're not leaving any kind of clues to the future about how Brooklyn became what it was, how New York City became what it was. So I'd say we're in this kind of historic moment of change where we're erasing our past. The last 10 years I've done a different photo essay every 2 weeks. Each photo essay looks at a different part of New York City's waterfront. Up to this point it's probably about, I'd say 200 photo essays. I'd say I have several 100,000 photographs in this because I shoot everything digitally. And I'm shooting it with an eye more towards documenting these spaces and these neighborhoods. So I tend to, I guess you'd say, overshoot. I really tend to shoot a lot, knowing that these places might just disappear. In terms of selecting, it's a lot of editing. I mean, I really, I may shoot like, let's say 500 photographs of a building, but really only like about 5 or so of those photographs in terms of wanting to exhibit them. And then the other, 495 photographs I view as being, in a sense, like this documentary archive that helps tell the story of these places. So, in 10 years, 20 years, those other photographs might take on a little more importance as well. So I would write a photo essay, post it on my own website, and then it would go on to like larger publications. So for about 5 years, I was self-publishing them, but they would go on to, the New York Times would feature them, or different magazines in New York would feature them. Different websites would kind of pick them up as like a news story and feature them. And then 5 years ago, I got hired by another website in New York called Curbed to write the photo essays just for their site. So they now have hired me to do the same series, just photographing whatever I want to photograph in New York for them. In my neighborhood here in Brooklyn, in Sunset Park, there's this amazing building that's on the street corner, which is this old 1800s police precinct. And it's a building I've been looking at for years and years. I've photographed the outside of it, I've gone inside and documented it. And it's a New York City landmark, so theoretically it's got some protection here from developers and from, the city. But unfortunately, it's in terrible condition. The building is kind of falling down. I mean, the inside is gutted. It has like no floors. It has no roof. It's full of hundreds of pigeons that live in there. And so it's, I guess, it's something that's called demolition by neglect, where the city or the owner of the building just lets a building fall down because they don't want to have to pay to repair it. And I mean, with that building, it really is like one of the most architecturally and historically unique buildings in this part of Brooklyn, but they're just letting it kind of fall down. That nobody can decide how to like restore the building, how to save the building. My concern is that they're just going to let the thing collapse one day, or maybe give it a little nudge and help it collapse. That's one of the problems in New York, actually, is we have this landmarks law, which is theoretically supposed to protect these old structures around the city, but it doesn't have a lot of power, so we're losing so many historic structures all around the city right now, either through neglect or through really the Landmarks Commission allowing people to take buildings down or replace them or change them in some way that just removes all of their historic character. As we've moved back towards the waterfront here in New York City, as we've kind of torn down the industrial areas and decided we want to live at the water's edge again, we're also right at this moment discovering that we should not be close to the water in New York. Rising sea levels are this problem that New York City is facing right now, that's going to kind of force us away from the water's edge again. And so the photographs, to me, when I look at them now, I see these buildings, these industrial buildings that are like these amazing historical buildings, these amazing architectural buildings, but they're also the buildings that kind of caused all of this climate change and pollution that is now causing all the problems in New York City, that's going to completely reshape how we interact with the waterfront. And I think the most interesting thing to me that's happening in New York City is that we are taking on these new ideas. We are in some ways facing the challenges of climate change and of rising sea levels. The most interesting thing that I've seen is that we've, in some neighborhoods, decided to have like a planned retreat from the waterfront. So I've been documenting a process where the city is actually tearing down a whole series of neighborhoods and returning them to nature. And I think increasingly that's what we're going to see in New York City, and that's what I've been trying to document, is how nature is reclaiming the waterfront. How we've taken this like polluted industrial waterfront and kind of like now allowed it to become overtaken once again by like the natural world. you see it in the photographs too. One of the themes of the exhibit is really kind of this interaction between nature and the post-industrial landscape. So even in the photographs, you see these old crumbling piers or these buildings that have become completely overgrown. And I think that, to me, is, in a sense, the hopeful part of it, is that there is still some room for other forms of life in this urban environment. And like there will always be other forms of life finding a way to survive, even in the most polluted or neglected areas of the city. And I think that, yeah, to me, I guess that's the hopeful element, is that, you know, no matter what we as humans have done to the waterfront here, other species are going to find some way and some place to survive.